Hey everybody, welcome back to A Flawless Night. It's Monday, 7 p.m., not 7:16. We're doing Iron Culture presented by Mass, and I'm here with the good Dr. Eric Helms. And Dr. Eric Helms, I've heard, I have it on good authority that you've been thinking a lot lately about metabolic stress. Is
I
it
have.
was it fair to say that it's frankly stressing you out a bit?
You know what? It's I feel like it's requiring a lot of oxygen from me, but that I'm getting through it without it,
hmm
you know? So,
So
um,
metabolic
hard
stress, I mean,
hard to breathe.
what in the world? First of all, why do you care? And second of all, should I? And third of all, should the listener?
I think that is a great way of framing it. Well, I will say that given our audience, I would suspect that a lot of people have encountered the term metabolic stress in the context of it being one of those big three mechanisms for hypertrophy that the good Dr. Schoenfeld has proposed way back when in 2010. And it's been repeated since then. Like, hey, so metabolic stress is either causes hypertrophy,
Whoa, you
maybe independently.
dropped a C word, which is big in research.
Ooh, I know. Or maybe it has an additive effect on other pathways to hypertrophy, or maybe it just indirectly can impact hypertrophy, or some would claim it has no influence at all on hypertrophy. Um, but let me ask you this, Trex. How often, when you hear people in kind of the evidence-based sphere talking about metabolic stress, do you think that they really know what they're saying when they say metabolic stress?
What percent? 15% of the time.
I think that's pretty accurate. I would have been okay with anywhere from 12 to 18%.
Oh, good.
But since you perfectly chose the mean and the median in that value,
Yeah.
I think we're good to go. So yeah, the when I encounter people talking about metabolic stress, it is kind of this vague notion of like the burn, the pump, some hormones, metabolite accumulation, and then when you start to interrogate more, like, okay, so what metabolites and why do they accumulate, and then what type of training? That's when it is quite apparent that we're like, hey, don't ask me about that stuff, but like drop sets and shit.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important to understand what the heck are we talking about here. So metabolic stress, I think, is it is a very interesting. Don't get me wrong, but it doesn't have to be complex, but I think we do have to just understand, like, what does it stem from, what does it mean, and why is it important, and why would we even think it's related to, on some level, to a hypertrophy outcome. So, Trex, we've talked about energy systems before, and I remember we both had a kind of similar methods of teaching this.
Yeah.
Because people tend to get it twisted where they think, okay, sweet, so ATP, phosphocreatine, anaerobic glycolysis, oxidative phosphorylation. These are switches that are only one on at a given time.
Right.
And like you were saying, I think when you talk about how you teach it, which is very similar to what I do, when are these working? Always, all the time. They're always constantly on. But what they differ in is their efficiency, basically how much ATP yield do we get, and then speed. How quickly can they get us that ATP? And that is where some of these really interesting outcomes occur. So, resistance training, we got these intermittent high intensity contractions. And I say high intensity relative to everything we're doing in life, right? Jogging, talking, me moving my hands versus if I was doing like 8 RM wrist curls, right? Even though it might be the same joint action, right?
Yeah.
Um, Intermittent high intensity contractions, they're depleting ATP at a faster rate than we can replete with phosphocreatine because it runs out, or faster than we can use the aerobic system, the requiring oxygen system that we have. Because even though it's super efficient, the ATP yield per unit of time is not enough to get, okay, you have to get a lot of output done right now. So that means we have to rely on the faster but less energy efficient anaerobic glycolysis pathway primarily. And once we start shifting towards anaerobic glycolysis, anaerobic being without oxygen, right? Some things start happening. Okay. So we essentially see low muscle phosphocreatine levels, We see high lactate concentrations, and we see a subsequently dropping pH level and a buildup of various metabolites from the sustained use of anaerobic glycolysis. And I think it's really important to remember that when we say metabolic stress, that is a pretty damn ambiguous term, because there's something like over 4,000 metabolites that you can find in human serum. And when people are specifically referring to metabolic stress as a stimulus or even a causative mechanism, and I'm not saying I'm saying that, but people say that.
A lot of people are saying. Yeah.
People say it. What they're talking about is the accumulation and high concentrations of metabolites from resistance training, like lactate, inorganic phosphate, hydrogen ions, and others, that supposedly, augment at the very least, maybe, or indirectly, depending upon who you're talking to, result in a cascade that can cause hypertrophy, right?
Yeah.
So that is what we're talking about. So essentially, the more you have to rely on anaerobic glycolysis, the higher metabolic stress is. And there are some interesting things that occur as well, just from the process of how you get to using more anaerobic glycolysis, right? So this means that you're having this high output, but the output is sustaining. So we can also think of resistance training that is very, very high power or like minimal volume strength training. Like we're talking heavy singles or like medicine ball throws, where we're doing like 1 to 3 reps, very far from failure or reasonably far from failure, like a single at 80, 85% of 1RM. Long rest periods, low total volume, a low total density of training, where we could pretty much just rely on phosphocreatine and ATP. So not that, but when we're doing multiple sets or short rest intervals or anything of that nature, that is the type of training we're talking about here. And when you do that, there's also some mechanical things that are going on. So the actual contractions themselves actually create an occlusive effect, similar to what would happen with BFR, right? So you're actually preventing some degree of blood flow in and out of the muscle to the resulting effect of having essentially this increasing process of cell swelling. So the contraction itself has this effect, which I think is kind of cool. So essentially, you have venous occlusion, which creates hypoxia, and that's relevant. That just means low oxygen levels, because the lower your oxygen levels, it means the less you can rely on aerobic energy, right? And in fact, when we look at studies where they get people in hypoxic chambers, or when we look at the local effects of blood flow restriction training, we see an increase in metabolic stress, right? So your contraction itself does this, though. You don't necessarily need to put BFR in there. And the longer that a contraction is occurring for, and if it's a high enough strength and like moderate loads that you can do for multiple sets for 15, 20 reps, etc., you're going to see this localized muscle pump increase. Blood starts pooling, which furthers the occlusive effects, which furthers hypoxia, which actually has an effect on cell swelling, which amplifies metabolic stress. And it's this kind of feed-forward mechanism. And it's just important to understand that this is somewhat part and parcel with at least the local mechanisms of fatigue. So metabolic stress is to some degree self-limiting, right? As these metabolites build, as pH drops, you can't keep training. And the effect of that is I think there's the one thing that everyone agrees on as far as the metabolic stress role for hypertrophy is that, okay, if we're generating local fatigue and we still have to meet the force demand, how do we do that? And our best guess is that there is something called motor unit cycling going on. So if you were just to compare an EMG signal for a low load to failure versus a high load to failure, and if you were to incorrectly infer that told you directly about the degree of motor unit recruitment, not just the excitation of fibers and the total electrical signal strength, you would go, oh, well, high loads clearly cause more hypertrophy because the low loads never hit a peak. Therefore, we're never recruiting these high threshold motor units. We're not tapping into fast twitch fibers. We're going to get low hypertrophy. We don't see that. We've got literally dozens of studies showing that low load, high load to failure, so long as it's not super low load, we're going to get similar hypertrophy. So what we think is happening is that while you might not have the entirety of the motor unit pool active simultaneously, like you do when you lift 80%, 90% of 1RM, you're seeing different motor units coming in and out and dropping to maintain that same force requirement of a low load. And eventually, everybody gets fatigued, so you get to the same kind of place. And so you could say, and there are some papers that will acknowledge this at the very least, even among researchers who are highly skeptical of a role of metabolic stress influencing hypertrophy, that at the very least, metabolic stress, which co-occurs with local fatigue, or at least more probably accurately, fatigue, results in the recruitment of the fibers which you want to grow, which allows low loads to failure and high metabolic stress training to be similarly effective to high load training, even if it's less total mechanical work. And the cool thing is that BFR, for example, blood flow restriction training, just accelerates this. So if you were to look at a whole bunch of BFR research, a lot of it is done with matched loads and matched reps. And you see greater hypertrophy from BFR when you do, say, the typical 30 to 40, 15, 15, 15 protocol, because the group not using BFR, doing that with 20, 30, or 40% of 1RM, is actually pretty far from failure, even though it still doesn't feel good. And the BFR group is much closer. And if you look at the few studies where they actually just do low loads to failure with BFR to failure, the BFR group on average is getting about 2/3 of the volume, but has a similar growth response, which is kind of neat. So it's essentially just inducing earlier fatigue so that you can recruit everything. It's accelerating the fatigue process so that you eventually can get that stimulus in all your fibers. So that is the one thing nobody disagrees on as far as potentially how metabolic stress can influence hypertrophy. But all the other stuff, does the signaling, or does lactate directly, or some of these metabolites directly have an additive effect on hypertrophy? Or is there some downstream effects from the blood pooling, muscle pump, cell swelling that impacts satellite cell proliferation, dissemination, incorporation to the muscle that increases hypertrophy long term? That's hotly debated and also very difficult to study. So this is what's been on my mind lately, Trex.
Yeah, that's a really good overview of energy systems and proximity to failure in a roundabout way, and how some of these training styles like BFR fit into the mix. Because I remember when I first was in grad school, the year was about, when was that? How old am I? It was about 2013, I think. And BFR was really hitting its stride in the literature. And I remember being so fascinated by it because of this. It was like the perfect thing where you're just starting grad school, learning all this physiology, and now there's this cool training method that's kind of picking up popularity, and papers are coming out left and right. But yeah, really, really solid overview there. And one of the things that kind of drives me nuts continuously, and this isn't me like with a gripe about, I'm not like shaking my fist at the sky, but, I wish I could give a better answer as someone who studied, my dissertation research was on, supplements that increase purportedly blood flow to active muscle, right? So citrulline malate and dietary nitrate via beetroot juice. And man, the number of times people have asked me, so if I get a better pump, does that mean I'm going to grow more? Or does a better pump mean a better workout? Or can I reliably improve the quality of my pump? There's still so many like really basic questions about the pump specifically that elude us. It's very, very difficult to study, and I'd be really interested. Here's a study that has bounced around in my head that I would be curious to see how this plays out if someone were to do it. I'd be curious to see if self-rated assessments of how good your pump was actually correlated with post-workout muscle cross-sectional area or volume, depending on how you wanted to measure it.
Oh, Trex, I've got good news for you, my friend.
Have you done it?
We're doing it.
Oh, man, that's going to be cool. I honestly didn't know that. Have you ever told me that?
Yeah. No, I don't think I have.
Okay.
It's part of my PhD student's Takehiro's PhD. So
okay,
his whole PhD is going to be looking at proxy measures during exercise, some after exercise, and whether or not they relate to one another, whether they agree, how reliable they are, and then do they actually relate to long-term hypertrophy. So one of
Yeah.
the studies we have planned is to look at the muscle oxygenation, so using NIRS,
Yeah.
near infrared spectroscopy.
I know about
Um,
NIRS. Not
yeah.
I
So,
had many a nightmare about NIRS.
well, then I may be
Finicky.
hitting you up. Yeah,
Yes.
that's exactly been the experience of the people in our lab who've used it. We haven't used it for resistance training yet, but we've done it with some like cooling or heating one limb during cycling.
Yeah.
So anyway, using NIRS, so we can look at deoxygenated hemoglobin and other markers of proxies, I should say, of metabolic stress, if you will, and then also having them rate their perception of a pump, and then also looking at post-exercise ultrasound changes in size. So
Nice.
that will be pretty cool. And then long term, we're talking more than a year from now, looking at does that have anything to do with
Yeah.
how much you grow in response to these protocols? So
Yeah.
that I think you'll be really interested in. But now here's something that gets in my head a little bit, Trex. I don't know that increasing blood flow is actually enhancing metabolic stress. If anything, it might be going like reducing it. I
Yeah.
also don't know if increasing blood flow would enhance the pump or have it be less, because like BFR induces a pretty nasty pump because it creates blood pooling, because importantly, it's not occlusion training, it's blood flow restriction training.
Right.
So you're doing it in such a way that you're still allowing blood to get into the muscle, but not escape. So you get some gnarly pumps from BFR, but you're restricting oxygen delivery.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that I think, I actually remember, I think it was actually an argument I got into with Mike Israetel. He tends to, and this is a colleague of mine. This is not someone I don't even think he necessarily holds this belief anymore. But I remember early on, before the beta alanine literature was well developed, he was skeptical as to the utility of beta alanine from kind of a more mechanistic perspective. He was like, hey, this is a buffering agent, right? That means it is preventing this drop in pH. It is helping us deal with fatigue and metabolic stress. And we want to use this for hypertrophy, but metabolic stress is a mechanism of hypertrophy. So beta alanine might be actually inhibiting hypertrophy. Yet we don't see that, right?
Yeah.
And you could even make an argument that if you're increasing blood flow and you're improving oxygen kinetics, and you're making it so you don't have to rely as much on anaerobic glycolysis, that, oh man, that's going to be worse for hypertrophy. And I think I don't buy that. And I think if metabolic stress really was like this is a key component to hypertrophy, maybe we would be seeing some of that, but we don't. We typically see neutral to, I would say, just neutral effects for beta alanine. For some other blood flow supplements like you studied,
Yeah.
citrulline and a nitrate, if anything, greater work, or actually, at least better acute outcomes, right? I don't think there's a whole lot on hypertrophy longitudinally.
Yeah, there's really not much at all on hypertrophy. But yeah, it's interesting because you look at it, especially with nitrate, improvements in things like not just strength endurance, but also just power output. So there's some interesting, apparently direct effects on the muscle, which would make sense because, midway through my dissertation work, someone published a paper saying, hey, by the way, muscles store nitrate. And I was like, what? Why? How? So that's
Where?
yeah, where that's the fun thing about working. Like some people with their dissertation work, no offense, it's on a well-tread topic, right? And it's like, okay, we're really just nailing down the finer details. I just remember like it's a fun experience doing a dissertation on a topic that really is kind of carving out, into a new little area, because we just like learn this fundamentally massive thing about nitrate. And I was like, well, I already planned my study. Like, I don't know what you want me to do, but like, it would be really weird if nitrate didn't have a direct impact on muscle. You'd be like, well, then why are we keeping it there? That's very, certainly a very curious thing. But yeah, like when I got into that line of research, I had all these high hopes that everything was super simple, and it turned out not to be. And by the time I made it out the other end, I was like, I don't know if what we feel as a pump is actually measurable as cross sectional area. I don't know if increasing blood flow to the muscle would actually increase what we believe to be the pump. If it did, I'm not entirely certain that that would be beneficial for hypertrophy. Basically, I walked out of it saying, I don't think I know anything about this topic other than the three outcomes that I actually measured.
Yeah. And, one thing that I find really interesting on that same topic is a lot of the times when you see people interpreting research about metabolic stress, um, one thing that people will talk about or researchers will write about is cell swelling, right?
Yeah.
Which is a consequence of hypoxia and a consequence of metabolic stress. And then what you will see is that some much more applied researchers writing about it, like maybe an SCJ article written by a master's student who's interested in like applied exercise science, and maybe if their advisor is not particularly savvy in the physiology behind it, they will conflate that with muscle swelling.
Yeah.
Which is not the same thing.
Yeah.
And I don't think that the experience of the pump necessarily is the same thing as cell swelling.
Right.
The cell is not the same thing as there being more blood in the whole muscle, right?
Yeah.
So I would be, because I think there could be instances where you're getting cell swelling, but you're not getting a pump. Like, I guarantee you, if you do repeated 800-meter sprints, right, with limited rest intervals,
Yeah.
you're going to be pretty heavily relying on anaerobic glycolysis, and the resultant outcome of that metabolic demand is going to cause some swelling. But I don't think you're going to be coming off the back last 100 meters of your fourth 800 going, bro, like my glutes are so pumped.
Yeah.
It may be burning, but you're not going to be feeling like you just did a bunch of hip thrusts.
Right. And honestly, I would take it, another kind of revelation I've had over the years is I used to think that getting a better pump, I was like really into these supplements and thinking, okay, I'll increase blood flow through these nitric oxide pathways. I think what we experience as the pump in terms of muscle swelling has a lot more to do with venous return than it does flow to the muscle. Because one of the things you find really consistently in the nitrate and citrulline literature, what I found in my dissertation, and we looked at blood flow to the muscle at the level of the conduit artery, so like really big picture blood flow, and then all the way down at the microvasculature using some really nitty gritty methods developed by Adam Lucero. Adam is brilliant, and I literally could not have done any of my work without him. He built the hardware and the software to allow the NIRS measurements that we made. And we found he's brilliant. And we found essentially no impact of citrulline or nitrate on these, big picture or super nitty gritty indices of blood flow to the muscle. And that's pretty common when you look at the literature on increasing blood flow via things like nitrate and citrulline. It's like, hey, I'm a healthy, active 20-year-old male, and it's like, dude, your blood is flowing. Like you're everything's working. The cardiovascular system is finely tuned, and whatever blood your muscle should be getting in order to complete the exercise it's doing, it's going to get. I think what really distinguishes a pump from a non-pump is what does the return look like? Because like you said, with BFR, we are literally blocking it. And that was a part of my dissertation too, was with a really cool like inflation cuff. We would instantaneously either block venous return or we also blocked arterial flow to the muscle, which oddly enough, IRB did not care. Arterial occlusions during resistance exercise did not bat an eye, but they were very worried about the crystal light that I was putting in the citrulline supplement. They were highly concerned about that. Or no, that was for a previous study on caffeine, I think. Anyway, kind of funny the things that get through when people are reading it and have no idea what they're looking at. Now, it was safe, but I expected quite a battle over that. And of course, we had no incidents. Everyone was happy and good. But yeah, man, I just think, through many years of wrestling with these kind of semi-related topics of the pump and metabolic stress and cell swelling, to me, what's really kind of comical, not to be snarky, but it's kind of funny to think I was so certain, not just about how this all worked, but even how to utilize it in practical application. I was so sure about that before I started grad school in like 2012. And then grad school for me was a process of saying, we don't know really much of anything about this, which was humbling. And I think that the humility is probably the best lesson of grad school, I would say.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think just to your point about like the IRB, the actual the members of the board who decide whether it's ethical or not, if they don't know about something and they know a little bit about something else, you can see the Dunning-Kruger effect play out. Like, so when you start talking about BFR, it kind of just all gets lumped under this thing, and they're looking for you to cite some research to say it's safe. And if you did, and I guarantee you did, then thumbs up. But if they're not really aware of some of the deep physiology, the difference between arterial occlusion pressure and venous occlusion pressure, they're not going to pick up on that. But kind of everybody's heard like, oh, artificial sweeteners, like that's, is that a thing we need to be concerned about,
Yeah.
So
yeah, don't worry about like, blocking the femoral artery. It's fine.
Yeah, and that's one of those things. I think even people who read BFR research, some of those deeper details they don't pick up on. Like if you read the methods, and this is just for completeness since we talked about it, like what they will often do in some of the labs that are a little more mechanistically interested in what's going on is they will actually assess heart rate in some or distal place from where you're actually occluding blood flow, increase the cuff until they can't even pick anything up. And that's the complete like occlusion pressure requirement. And then they'll back it off to a percentage of that because they're actually measuring blood pressure.
Yeah.
So you'll see typically like 60 or maybe as much as 80% of arterial occlusion pressure, so that you are still getting arteries, which easy mnemonic. They deliver away from the heart, so it's to the muscle, and then you got venous return, which is actually what is being restricted. So you get this delivery in, but then less coming out. And it is that pooling of blood, if you will. It's not actually a pool, but you're getting a higher blood pressure in the muscle, which is probably what we experience as the pump, because more is coming in at a rate than it can go out. And I think when you think of that to me was revelatory, because I was like, oh, the pump, blood flow will enhance that. And I was like, wait a minute. If you're improving blood flow, that's not what it is. It's how much is getting trapped in there and can't get out. And when you think about the things that we do backstage before we get on stage to try to get a pump, we're limiting the end range of motion. We're doing continuous movement. We're trying to, we're trying to feel ourselves into a way of manipulating our performance of exercises to create this kind of rhythmic effect where there is blood that is getting in but can't quite get out. So you're right. It's not about blood flow to the muscle. It is about how do we trap more blood in the muscle. So anyway,
if that's helpful, and we're still not really sure.
If that's helpful, and to be honest, Eric, I'll tell you this: if it was a very straight up, easy way of I should say a straightforward, direct causal relationship between metabolic stress and hypertrophy, and that was perfectly mirrored by our perception of the pump, we would already know it.
Yeah.
One of the easiest way to do this actually is, and they've done this in multiple studies now, is they will take high load, volume equated training, and then just put BFR on top of it. And it doesn't seem to induce more hypertrophy, yet you can measure with, say, NIRS, for example, that there are greater markers for metabolic stress. So if it was just purely additive, like, hey, if I could just, throw a bunch of lactate on top of your muscle in the middle of it, doing the same amount of volume magically as with a high load, the same, proximity to failure, which is the hardest thing to actually match, then it should be producing more hypertrophy. But we don't see that,
Yeah. Now, having talked about 30 minutes worth of trash about the pump, I do want to acknowledge this morning somebody got a nasty one, and that somebody was me. And
let's go.
My love affair with lifting continues. I would say it's at the hot and heavy stage. we're past the flirting. It's getting pretty serious, and it's awesome, man. Having so much fun in the gym these days, and my shirts they're getting tighter. I'm telling you, man, things are happening. So I'm excited about that. All
Are you
right,
experiencing some body recomposition, Trek?
I have to be. You're talking about a man that was extremely detrained. So yeah, I haven't been. I think I told you I've been basically just having fun. Like I haven't been like doing a whole lot of like weighing myself and taking circumferences and things like that. And by haven't been doing a lot of it, I mean I've literally done none. Right now, my goal is to wake up, uh, go to the gym, have fun, eat a ton of protein, keep the calories in check generally. And I think that's going to pay off. And I think for me right now, the peace of mind of not sweating the details. I mean, it's like,
You're just letting it happen, which I think is great. You're
yeah,
not like being uber focused on it, and I think that is the way that body recomp happens in 90% of studies on
yeah.
untrained individuals. Which you're not quite untrained, but
I'm
you're
pretty
you're you're
untrained.
you're, you're detrained. You're
Okay.
detrained.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, because you've got a whole lot of muscle memory going for you. So I
Yeah.
think you're actually almost in a better state than an
Yeah.
untrained individual.
No, that's true. And like the way I view it in terms of like not being super meticulous about the details is like I basically feel like I'm like on like a 9 hour car ride, and you don't really want to be like 20 minutes into it saying, "Are we there yet?" Like
100%.
there's a long way
100%.
to go here, and like there will be a time where it's like, "Oh, okay, probably time to like tighten things up and refine some things." But like at a certain point, you just got to get on the road, and that's what I'm doing right now. So it's been a lot of fun.
All right, here's one for you. I have an elbow thing. Neutral grip bicep curls are more comfortable. Will doing only hammer curls lead to okay overall bicep growth in the long term, or should I still try to do some quote unquote regular curls?
Ooh.
And if you want, I can tackle it.
I mean, you're the best person to tackle it, but I'm willing to make myself vulnerable and throw myself out there for you to come around and collect, and clean up the answer I gave.
Go
But
for it.
before I do that, I do have to retract the apology that I gave on your behalf, Helms. I blamed you and a software as completely innocent bystanders earlier, and I do deeply apologize for that lapse in judgment and lapse in character on my own behalf. Now,
We all make mistakes.
on to more important things more important than character and ethics and judgment. We're talking about biceps, okay? If I were in that situation and, standard curls were bothering my elbow, hammer curls were feeling okay, I do think that you're going to have some trouble, I would think, maximizing the growth of that inner head, of the more medial head of the biceps. So my intuition as a person who is zero, I do not participate in this game of the whole functional anatomy thing. If I were in that position, the only reason I said I would take a crack at this is because I have an exercise I love when my elbows are bugging me or my shoulders are bugging me. What I like to do is a single arm dumbbell curl on the preacher curl bench. And usually I take a light load. It doesn't take much. It's the kind of exercise where like I'll knock a huge percentage off my normal curls and still get a really great stimulus, totally focusing on that more medial head. I can usually take a light weight, do some high reps with that, and get a tremendous stimulus for the biceps. And because of the way you're doing single arm on the preacher curl bench, you can really maneuver around a little bit to put your elbow and your shoulder in a position that feels much better. So when my joints are getting creaky and I want to get the biceps fired up, that's what I do. Now I'm kicking it to the nerd to tell me how wrong I was.
I know I don't think you were super wrong or anything like that. I would just remind people of, okay, when we think about our biceps, what are all the muscle groups involved? So you do have the biceps, which are biarticular. They do cross the shoulder, so they are weak shoulder flexors, but they are absolutely elbow flexors. And, they do have an impact on supination, but they also just flex the elbow. So somewhat independently of what your forearm position is, they're absolutely going to be contracting. And you can choose exercises which have a beneficial resistance profile, to where they're loaded in the bottom position. And you can choose exercises that stretch them independent of your forearm position. Like if you were to do an incline curl, or I know the exercise name that you hate, the Bayesian curl, where you're doing arm behind your back like an incline curl, but you're using a cable, so it provides resistance out the gate so that it's not the peak resistance point when the bicep is shorter. And you can do those neutral grip. There's no reason why you can't. Would it be slightly less stimulative? Maybe, but there is a point where that stuff doesn't matter. I think you can always speak in degrees. Like, for example, you could say, hey, which one of these two oceans has less water in it? The one that's here in front of me, or right after I took a teaspoon and took a little bit of water out of it? We can understand that it really has no impact on how much water is in the ocean from any kind of, like impactful way, right? So I think it's important to remember that your ability to train effectively and not have pain inhibition is far more important than something as minor as your forearm position. The other thing I would say is that the size of your biceps is not actually just due to the biceps. We do have the brachialis, which sits kind of underneath it at the distal portion of our arm, which does make your arm look bigger, even though it's a little more deep and not as superficial. And that sucker doesn't care about your forearm position. It's monoarticular. It's just, do your curls, right? The brachioradialis, it kind of helps you move back towards neutral. But again, these are monoarticular muscles that, the only thing that's going to impact their quote unquote stretch and then the tension that they have is, do you extend your elbow all the way at the bottom of the curl? And then, do you apply force at that point? So I think the impact of only being able to do neutral grip arm work is going to be really, really minor, and typically a worthwhile trade-off if it helps you manage tendonitis, because really managing tendonitis is basically about not pissing it off too much and letting it get back to baseline. In my highly non-clinical practical experience, just somebody who lifts and helps other people lift weights.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I think it was probably last episode I mentioned that my golden rule as I kind of get back into lifting is if an accessory or auxiliary type exercise is giving me any pain, I don't do it. So, if the listener were to kind of try the variation I mentioned and say, no, that's still bothering it, punt. Like, absolutely. Like you said, I mean, especially when you can do some form of elbow flexion, probably many forms, like you said, a lot of different variations of elbow flexion, like not worth it to push it just to get out that little extra few drops of gains. And so for me, there's certain exercises that for long periods of time, I just don't do them because they just bother me. So definitely live to fight another day.
Excellent. So yeah, Smosey, that is our answer to your question.
Helms, let me ask you, which YouTube channel are you monitoring the chat of? Because I believe I'm able to look on my phone, and that okay. Should be working.
Good. I'm on Iron Culture. If
okay.
You want to go to the Mass Office Hours channel.
Yes, I will do that momentarily. But do you have another question lined up for us?
Yeah, actually, Sithers, one has a very helpful comment. Trex, you should mute the live stream when you open it on your computer. Sounds like it's taking audio output and sending it our way, which may be the case, but maybe not. But then, as a follow-up question to our discussion of biceps, Sithers asks, or states, we normally think of neutral/reverse grip curls to target forearms more, but wouldn't those wrist positions lengthening the muscles that are responsible for supination mean they're better for biceps? I actually think that's plausible. One of the reasons I've heard people argue that, say, a reverse curl is better for the forearms is because it actually puts the biceps in a poor position, so the forearms have to work harder. And a lot of the times, things don't really work that way. A great example is doing seated calf raises. And the idea is that by shortening the gastroc and putting the gastroc in a poor position, which it indeed does, that you'll get better soleus growth. And then actually the two studies we have where we compare seated to standing calf raises, the only thing that happens is you get shitty gastroc growth and the same soleus growth. And that's because for most monoarticular muscles, it's really uncomplicated in how do you train them. Use a full range of motion and train because they only cross one joint. You don't have to worry about stuff like that. So anyway, yeah, I do think this may sound hypocritical, Trex. You can tell me. I think sometimes we put a little bit too much thought into manipulating exercises, especially for kind of single joint stuff. If we start talking about muscles that are synergists and work in conjunction on multi-joint exercises and can be performed with different motor strategies, there's a lot of overlap, 100%. You want to start talking about back training or leg training, I think there's a lot to be said because some people can use a much more hip versus knee dominant strategy, and there's like 6 muscles which can retract and depress your scapula, right?
Yeah.
And we are typically retracting and depressing our scapula with elbow flexion, right? And also shoulder extension. So I think when we're talking about that, yes, we do need to think about some of these things, especially when you're in the real world and you're going, man, why does this person have really poor lat development here? Or they've got poor glute development, but they can squat a lot or something like that. I think that makes a lot more sense. But I've rarely seen someone do something like manipulate their forearm position, all of a sudden it unlocks a whole new level of bicep gains. And the last thing I'll say on this is going back to the BFR conversation. Another thing you can do, Sozi, or Smozy, BFR is actually really helpful as a way to deal with tendonitis. In my experience, tendonitis almost always has a load threshold to where it's a problem, right? I mean, if you're at the point where picking up a pencil hurts, like don't even go to the gym, like deal with it, right? But I have had periodic episodes of tendonitis, which impacts my ability to do curls and pull downs and arm work. And some of the things that enable me to still effectively train while dealing with that is relying more on neutral grip work. And then as I'm reintroducing or maintaining some degree of non-neutral grip based bicep work, I use BFR so I can use a very low load for all the reasons we talked about earlier.
Now, someone on the other channel, and by the way, folks, you can catch Iron Culture presented by Mass on 2 different YouTube channels, the Iron Culture podcast or the Mass Research Review YouTube channel. Someone asked if doing BFR can increase your vascularity. Do you know what the current perspective on that is, or the current consensus?
So what I will say is that I don't know of any measures of what we would describe as vascularity, which is the subjective appearance of seeing more veins, right? But we do see data, and I am aware of some data. I don't know how robust it is because I haven't done a deep dive on this specifically, that BFR does seem to enhance the body's ability to deliver blood, or at least markers for better vascular function in a given limb or location. So increasing microvasculature, you would think that probably goes alongside maybe some bigger things you could actually physically see. But I mean, like if you have higher capillary density or something like that, you can't see that, right?
Yeah.
I think we forget just how small most of our blood supply veins are, right?
Very tiny, very tiny. I need to get out ahead of a controversy, Helms.
Let's go.
Someone in the chat, I believe the way they put it was Trex's traps are out of this world at the moment. I want to come clean. Approximately 15 minutes before we recorded this, I was dead asleep on my couch. Got home from work, passed out. I've been pushing it pedal to the metal. And what happened was I'm wearing a collared shirt underneath a hoodless sweatshirt. So I believe that in my deep slumber, there's just a whole bunch of collar bunching up underneath my sweater. So either there is a tremendous illusion happening, which seems to be most likely, or I remade all my gains over the course of just a few weeks. So I think...
Or third option.
Yes.
You're specifically making gains in your upper traps, which I've heard from very reliable YouTube comments that are loosely based on half of a study that they don't understand
Oh,
indicates that you're using anabolic steroids,
oh,
not just returning.
I'm getting crushed on the internet already. I fall
Mhm.
back in love with lifting for 2 weeks and I'm already getting the natty or not treatment. Unbelievable. I have wondered, like, because I haven't trained very effectively for like several years, if just me getting back in shape, if people be like, oh, this guy, unbelievable. He just hopped on the sauce. But
Can
who
I have
knows?
a tangential comment on that I think
Yes.
is really interesting? Something we've had Alex Coliari Turner on Iron Culture podcast a couple times, and we've talked about whether or not steroids give a permanent advantage. And one thing that I see a lot, because I participate in the natural bodybuilding community, is kind of this general misunderstanding of how that even occurs. And it is essentially, to our best understanding, even though we're still trying to figure it out, the same mechanism by which you right now are making great gains.
Wow.
It's just muscle memory,
Makes you think.
right? Yeah, it's not something distinct to where you have this unique propensity to retain higher levels of muscularity or get back to it from anabolic steroids. It's that if you surpass your natural limit with anabolic steroids, the idea is that you would be retaining some of the epigenetic factors and the myonuclei that you could not have otherwise had, so that when you lift without them, you have a higher ceiling.
Yeah.
But what people are missing is that means the only way to have a permanent advantage from steroids, at least from the mechanisms we understand, is for you to actually take them and get past your natural limit, and then importantly, do that without actually shutting down your natural testosterone production levels, which would lower your natural limit once you got off. Which in many cases, and I know a ton of ex IFBB pros and high level bodybuilders who are enhanced after a sufficient number of years and dosage to actually get above their natural limit, which is a lot of muscle mass, they now need to be on TRT.
Mm.
And I think people also think we have really, really robust data on this. Like, oh, we've got all these studies where, randomized RCTs and meta-analyses where we gave a bunch of people steroids, gave a bunch of people placebo steroids, and then we just saw who was bigger 10 years later when they got off. No, we don't. In fact, we're really just kind of looking at some observational, associational stuff, rat models, mouse models, and there's even questions as to the way which people are doing exactly what you're experiencing, Trex, of regaining muscle, because in not all cases do people seem to retain, or animals even retain their myonuclei. It seems to be like kind of dose dependent upon how much muscle they gained over what time, which is basically a proxy for how long and how much were you taking as far as anabolics, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, that was something that I had been thinking about lately as well, which I thought may be interesting to the dear listener.
Yeah, good to get that off your chest. All right, Helms, I'm going to actually carry some of the load here. Okay, I got a couple nutrition questions. I don't have to recklessly speculate about exercise selection and functional anatomy. Number one, considering that some people have common intolerances to certain foods, and people have different genetic influences that may dictate how they respond to certain dietary practices, considering all the little types of things we can do that might make a small impact, such as things like beetroot juice, tart cherry extract, those supplements that do a thing that can be measured, but on their own don't really make a massive effect. Considering all that stuff, is it worthwhile to kind of individualize your nutrition and try to stack up a bunch of little things to see if they can, kind of in cumulative form end up making a meaningful impact for you? That is a really good question. And honestly, I think if you asked me that question 10 different times between over the last 10 years or 15 years or however long I've been doing all this crap, I think I would give you a different version of the answer every single time, because it usually comes down to what is my mindset and what is biasing my perspective on what is quote unquote worth it. Now, I'd love to say that I always could give a perfectly unbiased, objective answer throughout the entire time course, but I just don't think that's the case. I do generally, as a person who makes content and studies this stuff, I think it's valuable to point out things that are getting really hyped that in isolation are unlikely to make a large impact and therefore probably aren't worth a ton of your attention, right? I think one of the challenges in the fitness world is that there are so many folks who are very eager to amplify, you should be doing this and you should be doing that, you should be doing the other thing, and the number really dwarfs the number of people who are a little bit more conservative in their claims, right? So it does put you in a position where you're kind of biased to play defense a little bit and say that won't work, that won't work, that won't work. So there have been times in my career of making content and talking into microphones where I might have said, no, just, focus on the big stuff. Helms, you always call them the big rocks, go and, but I will acknowledge, like, over the years, I've also seen a really dogmatic approach to that concept that has absolutely robbed people of their joy for lifting, where it's like, no, don't worry about all the other crap. Lift, do each muscle group twice a week within this narrow volume range of sets per muscle group. Everyone trains the same way. Everyone should get this much protein, grams per pound of body. Like, you start to get into this point where you're standardizing and kind of homogenizing all of these factors of what it is to lift and eat. And it's just like, yeah, so we're all going to make 81% of the gains we could have ever possibly made just so that we're all doing the same exact thing and no one accidentally spends $20 on a crappy supplement, So I think when it comes to this question, it really comes down to a very individualized cost-benefit analysis that comes down to each one of these little things. Like, and the question itself had such a spectrum of things that a person could iterate upon, right? So like for me, Helms, I don't really eat apples. Is it because, what do they have? Are those the ones with arsenic?
Yes.
Yeah.
If you eat the seeds, especially.
Yeah. So is it because
Is that why?
Yeah. It's because I don't eat poison. Sorry. No, it's, by the way, I just want to make a little aside that's kind of controversial, but like, no, I'm going to leave that one alone. Never mind. It's for a different show. So anyway, I don't eat apples because I've noticed that when I eat a lot of apples, my tummy hurts. And so that falls under this question, this like individualization of like, yeah, like everyone should kind of have that mindful approach to eating where they're keeping an eye out for things that seem to, it's not all in your head. There are different foods have different compounds and nutrients and so on. Like, you may be picking up on a really consistent trend if some food just doesn't sit well with you. Other foods do. Maybe you feel way better when you have more carbohydrate, less carbohydrate, more fat, less fat. It's very worthwhile to actually mindfully take stock of how different dietary patterns are impacting the way you feel, the way you perform, the way you adapt. When it comes to things like supplements, then you have to get down to a really nuanced cost-benefit analysis that is perfectly individualized to you and your priorities. So if you are an elite marathon runner and you are in the hardest portion of your preparation period leading into a marathon where you want to set a personal record and qualify for that race that you've been trying to qualify for 10 years, should you be using things like beetroot juice and tart cherry? Probably. Like, I mean, I can tell you this. I had the great, oh wait, Helms, you were there too. Now that I think about it, we were in that event at Finland at the University of Jyväskylä, and Andrew Jones was giving a presentation about Nike's Breaking 2 project, and Andrew Jones was really heading up that effort. He had a role in kind of selecting the talent and putting together protocols for what are we going to do to hopefully help the first human being run a sub 2 hour marathon. And the answer is almost everything. Like, almost everything.
Turn over every big stone, small stone, and grain of sand.
The answer is everything, right? And I can tell you this, if I were a strength coach / nutritionist who worked with a baseball player who's about to sign, nowadays, Helms, I don't know if you've been following this, I think someone just signed a $700 million contract in Major League Baseball. Is it worth it for him to try tart cherry? I don't care. Do it. Like, as long as you're not going to fail a drug test from it, basically, like, dude, you got 700 million to play with. If you think
you can afford the third-party tested version of that supplement, I'm pretty sure.
Yes, if you think that it might have a benefit, it's worth exploring in that scenario. So one of the things I really love about the evidence-based fitness kind of culture, for the extent that I've been a part of it over the many years, is that it's been really helpful for helping people, pardon my language, refine their bullshit detector. One of the things I dislike about it is that it has turned everyone's bullshit detector up to 11, where things that are contextually valuable or have a very small impact have all been, not, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but a lot of people have said, nope, too small to care about, forget about it. And the question is, when everything outside of the massive rocks is too small to care about, it doesn't leave you a lot of room to explore the fun elements of what make this, in my view, a really enjoyable pursuit. Some of that self-experimentation and, the quest to achieve what you've not achieved previously. So that's a long-winded answer, maybe a bit more philosophical than scientific, but I think ultimately my answer is, is it worth it to, once you've managed the big stones, play around with the little stones? I think yes, and I think when I did give myself the latitude to play around with the little stones, those were the most enjoyable and fulfilling years of my time as a lifter.
Well said, Trex. And I have 2 comments that stem from what you just stated there. And one of them is actually related to one of the questions. The first one is just a quick, interesting fact. Did you know that apples are among some of the fruit that are relatively high in sugar alcohols? Particularly sorbitol.
Yeah.
And tends to be higher in the ones that humans eat nowadays, the farmed versions rather than the wild ones that they just get out in nature. And obviously, the more sweet, acidic, and large they are, the more sorbitol. So if you're eating some big, juicy farmed apples, that might be it's just a lot of sugar alcohol.
I go big or I go home. That's how I do apples.
That's what's up.
Yeah.
The other comment is related to focusing on the big rocks before you get into the small rocks. Or you could even say, if you were to organize this into a pyramidal-like shape, the bottom more foundational levels, and that as you get to the top of the pyramid, they're less important, but they do get your peak a little bit higher. And I say that because I was asked, when can we expect the 3rd edition to be coming out?
Oh my God. I laid my heart out and got really personal with this one, and you turn it into a cheap commercial.
Well, for a limited time, Trex. No, I'm just kidding. So I have actually finished the first draft of the training book. So I just wanted to put that out there. That does not mean that I have the final figures, that we have the cover, that it has been edited, nor that I have finished the nutrition book. But we can at least see the light at the end of the tunnel. And I just wanted to update people because I have been talking about how they're going to come out early this year. And depending upon your definition of early, I would still say that's likely to be true.
October's still early.
It's not the end of the year.
Yep. All right, man. Are you ready for my other nutrition question?
You know I am.
Okay, there's a question. Any evidence to support the idea of a maximum rate of fat loss per day, with the fat oxidation being a rate limiter / bottleneck? Implication being a deficit beyond this means muscle loss. I am aware of one paper that purports to have worked out the math on this. I did not spend a tremendous amount of time critically appraising the methods and calculations of that paper. And the reason why is I believe that the practical bottlenecks come into play well before any physiological bottleneck would come into play when it comes to maximum rate of weight loss. So I have actually gotten into the habit of recommending flat rates of weight loss. So what I mean by that is, if I'm working with someone and we're going to figure out, I prefer to focus on process-oriented goals rather than outcome-oriented whenever I have the opportunity. So, there are certain scenarios where you really do have to pick the outcome with some degree of precision. But for a lot of folks, who are just going to, I want to lose 15, 20 pounds, get leaner than I've ever been, not stepping on stage on a particular date, I always try to say, well, let's not worry about exactly how many pounds that's going to look like. Let's not worry about the end date. Let's just get on the track and select our rate of weight loss and go for it. And I've gotten to the habit, I used to focus a lot on percentage of body mass, and there's a lot of good reasons to do that. I'm not saying it's bad or that there's not a very, you could put together tremendous grids and tables about what percent of body weight you should lose per given unit of time. But I've trended more toward flat numbers because what I tend to find is, frankly, losing more than 2 pounds a week of actual fat puts you in a pretty doggone huge deficit. And I don't particularly care how far that is from because I don't think it exceeds the literal physical possible rate of fat oxidation that could occur during that time frame. I'd be stunned if the calculations work out that way, and I would then have to look into them very deeply because that doesn't have a lot of face validity for me, Helms, the idea that we can't oxidize 2 pounds of fat in a week. So, but what I tend to find is when people pretty much of most body sizes, we're talking about less than 300 pounds or so, when they start trying to lose more than 2 pounds a week, the deficit per day has to get so big that we really do sacrifice a lot in terms of sustainability and just building the habits that are not going to help us lose the first 3 pounds, but the ones that are going to help us lose the last 3 pounds, right? So building the habits to get a sustainable plan in place and adopt those behaviors and make them automatic. All of that is to say, I'm not really big on trying to figure out the maximum rate at which fat can be burned from the body for 2 reasons. First of all, that I think the practical factors come into play way earlier. The other reason is kind of a built-in assumption that just kind of hit me as I was wrapping up there is, the implication as it was laid out is that a deficit beyond that point means muscle loss. I think we got a whole lot of other stuff going on if we're going to try to predict how muscle mass is changing over the course of this time period. I think that probably oversimplifies the dynamic nature of muscle gain and loss to an extent that I probably don't want to get on board with. I mean, you could say maybe fat-free mass loss, and I'd be a little bit less bristly about it. But all of that is to say, I will acknowledge that paper exists. I haven't looked into it too much, and those are kind of my reasons for it. Helms, do you feel any differently about that?
I don't know if I would say differently, but I think in different contexts, there's some interesting things going on. When you have had a lot of experience working with people who have essential levels of body fat, trying to lose body fat, you definitely see that certain things seem to happen, and there is support for the broad outcome that you maybe can't lose as much fat in any given time window. But I don't think it is therefore necessarily true that there's a limit to the fat oxidation. So I'll walk you through this. We actually saw, and there are soon to be published with Dr. Martin Ruffalo protein analysis that we're coming out with, the meta-regression. One of our sub-analyses was noticing that higher proteins seem to be more beneficial the leaner you were for protecting against muscle loss. Plant a seed, okay? There's also the, I think it's the Kohler meta-analysis that does indicate more lean body mass losses with a lot of dispersion and variance around that relationship, the larger the deficit, right? And then there's the observation that I have as a bodybuilder and a bodybuilding coach, and through seeing the same anecdote across everybody, that you get to a certain point and the risk of losing muscle increases. And kind of what you don't want to see as a competitor or a coach is someone losing weight but not looking leaner. And there's obviously a ton of reasons why that can happen. They could have finally taken a shit, for God's sake, Another explicit episode here from Iron Culture, like last time. Sorry.
Yeah, we're getting a reputation around here.
I'm a sassy mouth. That's what I am.
You know what's also crazy that gets overlooked, in addition to the very crass example you gave,
Yeah,
um, taking a couple days off at the gym, like,
not having edema.
yeah, I've seen people who happen to be me in the middle of prep when they can't answer like, why is my weight so stubborn? I just didn't go to the gym for 3 days and just boom, like lost like 4 pounds reliably. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
crazy.
I mean, so I mean, you retain higher levels of muscle water, muscle glycogen, edema, and swelling from regularly training. Um, and you will typically notice after a period of time off from the gym during prep that certain muscle groups look sharper and then certain muscle groups flatten out. And that's what's happening, right?
Yeah.
So, but one thing that will happen if you continue to see weight loss and the person is not really looking much leaner, not just one of these kind of circumstances, is they start to look worse. They kind of start to look a little filmy. And then eventually, if you keep it up, like this flattening look turns into what looks like actual muscle loss. And you will see people who sometimes push in a way that is not conducive to their overall look of trying to get shredded, especially when they're trying to rush it. And they will look leaner in certain spots and then filmier overall. And it is this kind of process of losing muscle fullness while losing body fat. And sometimes I'm not even sure their body fat percentage globally is actually going down because they're losing both tissues. Now, if you were just to think about this really directly, like, oh, okay, well, cool. What's happening is they're trying to lose more fat than they can at their body fat percentage. Well, not necessarily. They're also in a very different physiological state. Stress hormones are really high. Sex hormones are in the toilet. Their ability to train hard is impacted by their inability to take in sufficient energy, carbohydrate. They may be even, just not feeling enough ATP for protein synthesis. Like there's low energy availability can, in and of itself, cause this types of muscle loss. So what we are seeing is a shift in the proportionate substrate that is being lost. I shouldn't say substrate, tissue that is being lost for the same or potentially greater energy deficit. It could be getting hit on quote unquote both sides of the equation, that maybe you're so lean that you can only liberate so much fat tissue. But I think it's much more likely that you are so lean, beat up, and suppressed and experiencing all the stress and experiencing all the negative aspects of low energy availability and on such low calories that you're inducing a state of muscle loss. And the body doesn't care, right? So it'll catabolize muscle for energy. It'll catabolize adipose tissue for energy. And if you're doing the things to increase one and or decrease the other, you're going to see this relationship. But it might be that the body is just as capable of losing body fat at 6% body fat as it is at 16, as it is at 26, at least in kind of the relevant amounts of tissue we're typically talking about before you're essentially eating nothing and doing cardio all day, that you're right. But I also think it is possible that when someone's at 6% body fat, they really can't be losing that much. And in practice, I can tell you that on paper, you probably should be able to rush it if you could prevent muscle loss. But I don't see that ever working out. Like when someone is, let's say, they've got just the beginning hints of their glutes are getting boxed in. And from there, most people in my experience need like another minimum of 6 weeks to get to the point where there's visible glute striations, and probably more closer to 8 to 10 to where they have like gnarly, oh, you're diced. Now, you could on paper just go, well, I'm just going to go on a protein modified fast, but it never seems to work. It just doesn't work. They get leaner in other spots, maybe a little bit, but they flatten out. They look worse generally. And they just kind of look like they got jumped in an alley and they got this like full body edema, and you just don't seem to be able to rush the last phases of conditioning, which makes me think like whether it's because you're just shifting where that energy makeup is coming from, the lean tissue, or there maybe is a limit to how quickly you can lose fat tissue. I don't know. But in practice, I think there essentially should be a cap of how quickly you try to lose body fat that narrows the leaner you get. And that's why sometimes like the contest prep lengths don't make sense for people who aren't really in depth with the sport. They go, okay, listen, you went from looking a little chubby in the off season to looking like you're ready for a cover model photo shoot in 12 weeks. How could it not just be another 12 weeks by the time you're shredded? And the answer is that going from like legally shredded, where you've got like a side glute and if you squeeze it on a side tricep, to having Brian Whitaker up and down, Dirk Emmerich deep grooves in your butt that not everyone can get with their level of muscle development or their fat distribution. But for those who can get it, it might take 20 weeks, in my experience, from there. And it doesn't seem to make sense, but it's because if you try to rush it, you end up losing the muscle tissue that you need to push out against whatever fat stores you have.
Yeah. Yep. It's tough because, like you said, it's always so it's so tempting to say, like, okay, I'm within striking distance. I'm just gonna rush it from here, right? Like you're like, I can do this. I can rip off the Band-Aid, and like in a just world where good things happen, maybe that's how it would work. But yeah, it never seems to go well. I've had the same experience, and I'm also like, I've always the first bodybuilding competition I ever did, someone helped me with my diet. They kind of coached me along, and they did their best. I was not ready to compete. It still went okay. Like I won the novice overall, so that was nice, but not the type of leanness where you would say like, oh yeah, that's kind of what natural bodybuilding is supposed to look like. After that, all my preps I did on my own, and I'm a habitual over dieter. I need to be in like Over Dieters Anonymous, because I just get to that point at the very end where I'm like, oh, I already did like 98% of the hard stuff. Now I'll just crank it up to 12 out of 10 here and just push to the end. And it goes poorly every time. So I literally, what I should have done the last time I competed in bodybuilding was hire a coach for the last 4 weeks to just talk me out of everything I was going to do. Because yes, I basically did what
eat up.
Yeah, I basically did what you were referring to, which is like, hey, I mean, this sport is basically competitive suffering. I can suffer way harder than anyone for the last 4 weeks of this, and imagine how shredded I'll be at the end. And yeah, it's one of those things where you got a problem. Like I remember vividly the prep where I got my pro card. Like it went okay, but I over dieted, right? And I remember my weight being pretty stubborn when I was basically like, hey, you're about a stage condition here. And I was like, but I'm so excited by how I'm looking. I'm going to keep pushing. And I remember I almost had this, like, your trajectory of weight loss over prep. You start out with the big weight loss. It slows. Then you're grinding out just grams of fat, right? And then I had like another dip in the last like
that's exactly the thing that I was talking about. You don't want
I had another dip in the last like 3 weeks of prep, and I was like, am I getting beyond shredded here, or should I be worried? And I knew deep down this isn't good. You're not supposed to, reawaken these precipitous losses in the last 3 weeks. I was like, okay, damn it.
So someone behind you's like, excuse me, sir, you dropped your hamstring?
Yeah, it was not ideal. So yeah, it gets the best of us, but it's like that's the duality of the competitive bodybuilder is you're absolutely, and I say this with love, you're insane. And that serves you well for a large portion of your competition phase, and then you need someone to rein that in toward the end. But yeah, good stuff, man. I think that was a really interesting discussion there. So let's see here. Do you have another one you want to do before we go? Maybe one from the iron culture side of things?
Yeah, there's one on a BFR that kind of came from what we said. There's some good comments there. Blug mentioned that there is some research showing a higher percentage of arterial occlusion pressure does seem to have vascular benefits, but needs to be replicated. So that sounds like someone who's actually read the research a little deeper than us. And then Alonzo has some questions regarding science communication. So this is good. All right. What do you think educators online can do better to educate what philosophy of science is? I see people, won't name names, criticize study designs while then citing studies without understanding how hypothesis testing works. One study won't tell you much due to the nature of statistics, aka how do we educate educators better on the philosophy of science? And I tell you what, Trex, this is a tough one. I will also not name names, but sometimes you see things and uh, it is jarring, the level of God, I'm trying to be diplomatic here.
Uh-oh.
Someone said mechanisms over outcomes easily as like basically their philosophy of interpreting research.
Hmm.
And I was just like, well, how did you determine the mechanisms? And it's like, okay, well, I know these content creators' perspective on how they believe things operate.
Yeah.
And I know the studies that they like to cite and that they believe support the position that makes sense to them. And those mechanisms were determined by outcomes in a
Right.
study.
Yeah.
So you get to this funny position where you essentially just have to choose what you feel like makes sense. But all of our mechanistic understanding of things comes from early exercise science studies that their outcome was a mechanism. And then we got into more applied work afterwards. And so here's an example of just there's clearly not an understanding of the philosophy of science, because to even take the idea of positioning mechanisms over outcomes or outcomes over mechanisms is not the correct context, because you have to use them to test one another. You get a mechanism to then state a hypothesis, right? And then you need to go back and go, okay, well, based upon what we observed in these applied studies, if that mechanism was true in the dominant factor, we can check it with this model. And when it's not, then you go back. So for someone to say that, it shows they clearly don't even understand what a theory is. And like the question asker was saying, Alonzo, great question, they don't necessarily understand how we go about the process of establishing hypotheses and testing for them, let alone to even get into like the statistics. Another one that I think you will appreciate, Trex, is I've also heard people go, a lot of these evidence-based guys, they're over-reliant on statistics. And then what they will do is they'll look at, say, 5 or 6 studies on a given topic. And 3 of them are one way, 3 of them are the other. And they will go through meticulously through the methods, sometimes even accurately. And I've actually seen some researchers do this who don't have very good stats chops, in my opinion. And they'll try to figure out the reason why each one of these N of 6 to 12 to 15, maybe 20 participant studies observe what they did. And one of the things that's never on the radar is it's just sampling variance. And then they look at these big meta-regressions, and if it doesn't fit their narrative, they're like, it's an over-reliance on statistics. And it's like, no, you actually don't understand that the concept of sampling variance, and you don't understand that if we knew the true relationship and we could simulate the data in 10 studies of people of only 10, we would have every time like 2 or 3 studies that went the opposite way. And if you read the methods, you might be able to find a reason, but now you're just chasing ghosts. It's a red herring.
Yeah.
The reason it was that way is because, Susie forgot to eat lunch the day that she had her caffeine protocol, or something that we don't even know about.
And this is really rough because you'll see like when there's an emerging body of literature, you'll see that there's like 3 studies on a topic with like groups of 8 people in each. And basically someone will say, well, the 2 studies that had mostly male subjects, the thing worked. And then the 1 study with female subjects, it didn't. So I'm going to ignore the entire concept of sampling variance and sampling error and just assume, I guess this just doesn't work in women. And it's like, brother, you made that conclusion based on 16 women. Like that is wild to have that level of confidence in the mechanism instead of zooming out and saying, hey, we don't have nearly enough data to make a conclusion that impacts roughly 50% of the human population.
Yep. I saw just today, big shout out to Stian Larson. He's done a lot of great work in biomechanics. They just, I think, pre-printed a protocol where they compared full range of motion, like put your knees on your chest, leg press, to 100 degrees of leg press, and didn't see really any visible difference in their Bayesian analysis and quadriceps hypertrophy. And the number of comments that were just like, long muscle lengths and shambles.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't know, like, are we going to ignore the Kubo study? And like also, do we look at glutes? And also, the next study could find the exact opposite results. And now, do you say, oh, the people who are in shambles? It's like the reliance on single study outcomes and feeling like just you're in a wind tunnel that changes direction every time a new study comes is some of it's part of the like the content treadmill, right? Like people need to say something about every new study. They need to have an a conclusion, and more importantly, people want to hear, what do I do with this, right? That is the most like, and this is true of our mass audience as well. They want to know, they want to stay up to date with research, and they want to know how the newest research should change practice. And in 8 out of 10 times, the answer is not at all yet, because we need to see enough studies that actually changes our perspective on the body of literature. And each one is a drop in a bucket. And eventually that bucket, oh, I see what's going on here. And like, that doesn't take away from my confidence that training at longer muscle lengths, produces more hypertrophy. It's another neutral effect, but I've still got these like 50% of them being positive effects, and I have yet to see a negative one. So that perspective is something that I think it's very challenging to have unless you have an understanding of some of these statistical concepts.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say, kind of answering this question, like, what do science communicators need to know about the philosophy of science? Like, when I did in my PhD program, they made us do a semester course on philosophy of science, which I thought was a pretty cool thing. That wasn't really...
It's not normal.
It wasn't like a common thing, especially back then. Now that I'm old, I think that was 2015. So that's
10 years ago.
That was 10 years ago, which is crazy. But that was a pretty forward-thinking course to make required in your first year of your PhD. And to be fair, you're literally getting a doctor of philosophy. You should probably take a class on the philosophy of science, right? It kind of makes sense that way. But I remember, saying like, oh, this is going to be a waste of time. It was really cool. I don't think that you're going to do gangbusters on is that the phrase? I don't think
I know what you mean.
I don't think you're going to absolutely explode YouTube with an 8-hour lecture on the philosophy of science that's oriented toward the fitness community. I don't know that the fitness community needs a ton of it. I think, frankly, one of the most valuable things you could do when it comes to communicating science and addressing the philosophy of science is acknowledging that there are philosophies of science. Like, I think that alone gets people to really open their mind a little bit and say, well, wait, what do you mean by that? And it's like, well, there are different perspectives on what it means to know a thing and the methods by which we come to know something. And I feel like just acknowledging that as a statement really cuts to the core of a lot of the more vitriolic arguments that happen in evidence-based fitness. And there was an episode of Iron Culture, episode 109, Empiricism versus Rationalism, where we kind of talked about, like getting back to that core question of like, well, what do you value more? If we were to create a dichotomy, do you value the idea of having a tidy narrative filled with mechanisms that help you get from point A to point Z? Or are you more in the camp of someone who continually updates your understanding of a topic based mostly on what you consider to be more endpoint type outcomes in studies, with the kind of current, common thread that throughout your understanding of the world being that sometimes I will observe things that are true that do not yet make sense to me, right? So the question is, do you, when you reach that fork in the road, do you reject what you've observed because it doesn't make sense? Or do you reject your understanding of what ought to make sense because of what you've observed? And that's definitely an oversimplification of what shouldn't really be viewed as a total dichotomy, but you get the idea, right? And so that was I think a really productive discussion. I'd love to see the views on that. I'm sure it wasn't great,
Yeah,
but
well, we've done a few philosophy of science episodes. I think the last one I really tried to like try to fit it into iron culture, where I was
yeah,
talking about, like what is models, and I tried to frame it with hypertrophy, because if you say hypertrophy in an iron culture episode, we get more views. But trying to explain to people why they needed to do empirical testing to validate models and how models work in the philosophy of science. Let's just say it wasn't our most popular episode.
yeah,
And that's another example. But I think that was a really productive discussion. And I think one really important thing that is practical for the listener right now is that your personality is going to have a major impact on which one of those philosophies you trend towards. And this, I think, is a modifiable factor. It's not fun to do what Trex you just described, encounter things in the world that you can't explain. In fact, you could even make an evolutionary biology argument that we are wired to reject such things and to try to find an explanation because it's a existential threat.
yeah,
And when you look at animals, when they encounter things that they just don't understand, or even just aberrant members of their own society, they like kill those animals, or they run, freak out, attack, scream, screech, like one of the things that I found really fun when my wife was still a zookeeper is the things they would do with behavioral enrichment. And sometimes just putting an odd colored object in a place that's not normal in a group of monkeys, space, and seeing them just try to deal with that. It's like, whoa, there were some wild responses to that. So when you are encountering something, and I'll give a very practical example, a hypertrophy study doesn't go the way you think it would. You're going to have an emotional response to that, and some of that is outside of your control. But then you have a choice to observe that response. And if it is one in which you are, like, some people are attracted to the evidence-based community because they like to have explanations, and they like clear mathematical black and white explanations, which ironically is antithetical to the underlying philosophy of science that being evidence-based is founded on. And the more you can be comfortable with not knowing the answers to things, the better you're going to ironically be at understanding the answers to things. Because that emotional drive to come up with an explanation, or to come up with an explanation to reject what you've clearly observed to be true, pushes you further away from the truth. And your ability to sit in that ignorance, that discomfort, and say, I don't know why this was observed, and I need to wait for further data and not have an opinion yet, and understand that science is about asking questions more so than it is answering them, is going to get you closer to the truth. And the unfortunate thing is that that's not exactly what engenders trust in the science communicator. So it does make our job a little bit harder to be good science communicators and also good philosophers of science.
yeah. That is one of the more challenging things about being a science communicator, in my mind, is when you observe, for example, a debate between two people who are more well versed on the topic than you are. It is very natural to defer to whoever seems most confident. And that kind of extreme confidence in a topic where there's a lot of unknowns, and there's probably more evidence that needs to be collected before we can really draw a conclusion. If you go into that type of argument, and there is a debate between two people, and one person kind of puffs their chest out and just says, we don't need any more research. I get it. I know it all. And here's how it works. And the other person's like, I don't really know. I mean, seems like there's a lot of conflicting stuff here. It might be another 10 years. Like, who are you going to go with? Like, who won the heavyweight battle? It's like, oh, yeah, the one guy seems so confident. I'm sure he's right. Like, come on. How could someone be that confident if they weren't correct? Which, as a rule, is not a good heuristic to go through life with. It's just, I'll defer to whoever seems most confident. That's not always the best idea.
I think you're totally wrong
Ah,
on that, actually.
there you go.
No, Trex. I think we've done a really good job here. We've covered a lot of questions. I don't have any more in mind. There is one question I can answer quickly. about how do you use BFR in practice. Do you use a manual BFR cuff and set the pressure based on perceived tightness, or do you utilize an automated one? You absolutely can go the full route and get an actual blood pressure cuff, or get some of the more expensive but still commercially available ones, and you could get to a certain degree of inflated cuff pressure. However, there are a number of studies which indicate a perceived tightness of roughly 7 to 8 out of 10 on the cuff does seem to result in sufficiently, for our purposes, similar outcomes, especially if you're training reasonably close to failure with BFR. Because really, what we care about here is that you can get the advantages of using a lower load, and it doesn't take as bloody damn long to get close to failure, because you get to do 20 reps instead of 30 to hit failure with 40% of 1RM. And that's kind of what matters, is get yourself to a perceived 0 to 2 RIR with a cuff at a 7 to 8 tightness, and you'll be able to use a much lower load, and it won't be as painful or as inaccurate as far as your proximity to failure, and it'll probably be more, or at least as effective as if you did it with a cuff.
All right, man. Sounds good. I think that probably does it for tonight. It has been, I tell you what, if you ignore the elements of this episode that made it one of the more chaotic and poorly produced of all time, and if you only find those little bits of discussion between the chaos, I actually I like what we talked about in this episode.
I agree. I would say also, if you like dubstep, you might think this episode not only was great discussion, as you just mentioned, but also had some nice musical accompaniment.
Yeah, I'm going to go through and listen when we hop off the call here, and I will assess the musicality, and that will determine whether or not edits happen.
I didn't say music. I said dubstep, but we can go from there.
Okay, but yeah, I appreciate everyone who stuck with us there. I have a lot of troubleshooting to do, but appreciate everybody. Now, if you like the show, we clearly need your support. We're not doing well. Like we're barely getting through episodes here. So if you want to support, and the good Lord knows we need it, there's many ways to do it. You can like, rate, share, subscribe, review, all that good stuff. Send a link to a friend, 5-star rating. You guys know the deal. Wherever you get the podcast, be sure to do all that stuff. If you really love what we're doing and you're like, wow, I like evidence-based fitness content, but I wish I could get more of it. I wish some of it was written, some was video, some was audio. I wish it came to me the first of the month, every month, always with regularity, never late. Check out the Mass Research Review. It's published by the two of us, in addition to our esteemed colleagues, Dr. Mike Zordos, Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple. We cover all the newest and best research, and you know what? We're not too hyperbolic about it. We try to say how you can use it, but we don't overstep, because we respect the boundaries of the philosophy of science, and we apply a nuanced statistical understanding. So, folks, thank you so much for being with us tonight. We love you. We appreciate you. And we will be back in 1 week with another episode of Iron Culture, brought to you by Mass.